Welcome to HB Tuners for Gen 2 Coyote Training Part 33. This training module we're going to be exploring how to dial in our cranking fuel and our warm-up enrichment so that the engine can crank and fire like stock, and it's also going to have the proper fueling when it's in that transitional period between cold and warm operation of our engine state. So we have a lot to cover. Let's jump in so we can check this out.
Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at working with our startup and warm-up conditions in our Gen 2 Ford Coyote applications. So when we want to go ahead and fire off our engine from its cold state, so it hasn't been running for, let's say, most of the day, or it's been sitting for days on end, getting the engine to fire off and run can sometimes be a challenge. Now, the OEM manufacturers have always done a great job of modeling everything so we can crank and fire our engine as expected. Now, once we start to modify the fuel system and modify how much airflow we have coming into the engine, say we have a supercharger, a turbocharger, or we have completely different intake manifold, throttle body, and intake on the engine, that can throw off some of this calibration that the OEMs have done. So what we need to do is jump in and understand the couple key areas that we need to pay attention to for cold starting and warm up type of conditions. Now, I have a data log that we're going to be pairing here to this tutorial that you can open up and follow along with some things in the VCM scanner side of things. Now, the file that I'm working with is going to be my tuned idle file. So we had our idle tutorial going through all the various aspects of the idle control and the torque-based logic in the idle control. I lowered down the startup targets in terms of the RPM. One thing I did mention in that tutorial, and I have long tube headers on my 2017 Mustang GT, that's our example car, that it drives me crazy. When I fire it off, it's obnoxiously loud, especially when I'm trying to start it in the morning when the neighborhood's quiet. I don't want it to fire off and idle at 2,000 or 1,800 RPM trying to warm up. I can command a much lower idle speed and a much quieter output from the exhaust in its warm-up mode. So that's partially what I have going into the tutorial. That was some of the changes that we made in our last tutorial, and that's actually what I capture in the data log here that we're going to be taking a look at. So let's just quickly revisit some of the idle control parameters so we can talk about that real quick, and then we'll talk about what we have going on in terms of our cranking fuel, and then where we're sourcing some things in our warm-up enrichment. So if we're finding if it's taking a lot of cranks to fire off our engine, what we need to do, or if we fire off our engine, if it seems to be running relatively rich or lean, what do we do? What changes do we need to make and what tables do we need to look at? Okay, so this is my tuned idle calibration from that last tutorial. I just labeled it here as tuned idle. If I go up here into my engine tab, and we're going to work our way right into the idle control. So I'm going to go here from general over to idle, and then here into the RPM. Now we know in our torque-based control, in this closed loop control, all we need to do is specify a target RPM we want it to idle at. And usually it'll sort itself out in terms of the throttle body opening and the spark timing amount that it tries to run. We know we can alter all of that in terms of the torque tables or in terms of our base airflow values, that it starts as a feed forward table into our torque and airflow based control for the throttle. I'm not going to get into that right now, but I just want to highlight what I changed to lower down my target idle and where the engine's actually idling at on this cold start, because I personally think it makes a huge difference in the character of the car. It's not obnoxious as it fires off in a cold condition. So I've went into the temperature based control right here, and I've changed the startup under the cold aspect to 1,000 RPM. I've also changed the base and the CESR, making sure they're 900 right here. And then even in the warm startup, I've changed that to 900. So that made a large difference right there. And then also, if we look at climate control setup, in our heater performance cold and warm, I've changed the startup here to 1,000 as a maximum. So I've lowered down the maximum RPM I'm going to let the engine to fire off to in its cold operation condition to 1,000 RPM. Previously, it would idle up to about 14 to 1,700 RPM with the stock settings in here, which, again, in my opinion, was obnoxious. It didn't sound good, and it made way too much noise starting the car up cold in a quiet neighborhood. So I made those changes, just a couple things to keep an eye on and to think about if you want to lower down the output, the volume output from the engine in a cold start. So what we need to do at this point, now that we know we've changed those parameters, we need to talk about the cranking fuel and our warm-up conditions and a couple other things that are associated with that. So the variable cam scheduling, that's going to be known as emissions reduction mode when we fire off the engine for the first brief period of time. our goal, or the Ford's goal, is to try to warm up the cats as quick as possible so that there's the least amount of emissions output from the engine. That's usually the worst on a cold engine, and they accomplish that in a couple different ways here. But let's take a look at what we have going on.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.